thank all of you for coming in. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. Two people out there have written me emails about something. Stephen wrote me a very good email, and he said that Yamamoto had said I can run wild for 6 months. I had said for 2 years. Stephen, we're gonna have to split the difference because the most reliable source says that he said I can run wild for 6 to 12 months. So we'll have to split the difference on that. Now, Stephen also put in an absolutely superb discussion of code breaking and the existence of codes and so on. And he also mentioned Joseph Rochefort, who is really a very important man in dealing with the war in the Pacific. Stephen, I thank you for that. But I must tell you, remember, this is a 4-week lecture series. And of course, in World War II, I would spend more time on that. Now, Stephen also said that I had mentioned that the Japanese had carried out all sorts of atrocities. Unit 731, that is the medical unit performing medical experiments on Koreans and Chinese. That is absolutely correct. I did say that. Stephen asked why. Why did the Japanese behave there in that fashion? And Stephen says it is because probably the racism of American presidents talking to the Japanese. Stephen, there I think are much more important reasons for the Japanese behavior, especially towards the Chinese and the Koreans. As Japan began to modernize under the Meiji Restoration, they saw, again, industrialization on their part. What did they see in China? What they saw in China, that China was being raped by the Western powers. China was not modernizing. China was losing battle after battle. The Japanese had nothing but contempt for them. In addition to that, one Japanese general saying, in effect, that we, the Japanese people, are descended from the gods, and we, the Chinese, we're descended from the gods, and the Chinese are descended from monkeys. So the racism is there. Remember, Western racism is penetrating all over the world. Superior races and inferior races. All of this stuff is taking place. Whatever Theodore Roosevelt, and whatever Taft may have said to the Japanese, that really isn't the issue. I think what I'm referring to are the more important things there. Now, I must tell you, be very careful, all of you out there, with quotes. Some of the quotes are single. There's one source for a quote. It's very hard to validate some of the quotes. In addition to that, people change their minds. So, for example, much more important, you could argue, than, let's say, Yamamoto saying, I can run wild for 6 to 12 months. I don't know what's going to happen after that. And he talks about the strength of the American people and the strength of American industry. All of that is true. He also said, actually, that if the United States enters into a war with Japan, or Japan enters into the war with the United States, Tokyo will be burned to the ground. He's absolutely right on that. It will be burned to the ground. We'll talk about that. But he also said, after Pearl Harbor, he said, if I can knock out the American fleet, the war is winnable. So the man who had said so many times that we cannot win the war does think at one point in time that the war is winnable. My friend George out there sent me a letter. George, your discussion of the Battle of the Marne, the first Battle of the Marne, is absolutely superb. It really is very, very good. But remember again, we've got to pick our shots here. You talk about the state of mind of von Moltke and Colonel Hensch's involvement in the Battle of Marne. It's all true. In a World War I course, I spend much more time talking about that. But the most important thing to remember about the first Battle of the Marne, the most important thing to remember is that because the Germans are stopped at the Marne and eventually retreat from the Marne, the war is not going to be over in a short period of time. The boys are not going to come home, as the Kaiser said, before the leaves fall. And in France, they're talking about the boys coming home by Christmas. It's not going to be. Because of what happened at the Marne, the war is going to settle down into trenches, 250 miles of trenches, from the Swiss border down to the English Channel. The war will go on for 4.5 years because of what happened at the Marne, and the political, social, and economic fabrics of European society will be destroyed. That's going to have enormous influence on what is going to happen in Germany and Europe and the rest of the world. So one last point about the codes. In 1944, a sidebar here, in 1944, in the presidential election, Governor Dewey of New York was running against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Dewey had learned that we had broken the Japanese codes, and he wanted to raise that as an issue in the 44 campaign, blaming Roosevelt, saying that, again, Roosevelt knew about all of this. He should have been able to stop, or at least defend better at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines. The Pentagon approached Dewey and said, don't use it as a campaign issue. Don't use it. We don't know what the Japanese know about our breaking of the code. Don't use it. And Dewey did not use it in the campaign of 1944. Whatever one may think of Governor Dewey, he was a good patriot and didn't do it. And the last thing I must say, George, be careful with conspiracy theories. George read a book, and the book suggests that Roosevelt knew about the impending Japanese attack upon Pearl Harbor, but deliberately did not warn or take defensive measures because he wanted to bring the United States into the war, whereas most Americans did not want to get into the war. That is an old idea, George. That's an idea that really circulated for a long period of time. There's no evidence, no historian worth his or her salt really believes that that was the case. It doesn't mean that somewhere down the line, after you and I are pushing up the daisies, that someone will find some more convincing information to prove that. But as of now, no historian is really, you read a book by a historian, be careful. One book does not tell an entire story. The function of the historian or the student of history is to look at the literature, compare it, and subject it to your own common sense. And then, again, you raised that, I think, somewhat whimsically, the idea that Roosevelt was influenced perhaps by a romantic liaison between him and Madame Schein. Now, Madame Schein was an impressive woman, and Roosevelt, we know, was not the most faithful of husbands, but the fact of the matter is, there's no evidence to suggest that that was the case. So my friends, be careful of conspiracy theories, be careful of quotations. Quotations change and people change their mind, and one book does not tell an entire story. Now let's get back to the war itself. I left you talking about the campaign, Operation Barbarossa. For 3 months' time, to use the expression of my students, the Germans are going to clean the Russian clock. There are a number of reasons for this. I went over them with you. Stalin's failure to heed the warnings that came from intelligence, all of these things, and also something else. I may have mentioned this before. It is very important, so forgive me for repeating myself. During that period that is known in Russian history as the period of the purges, we're not sure why Stalin did this, but he destroyed the best and the brightest in Russia, and particularly in the army. 60% of all Soviet officers in the Red Army above the rank of major were either executed or they were sent to rot in the Gulag. That's important. In a study made after the war, it was found that 85% of high-ranking, not necessarily high-ranking officers, major and above, 60% of Red Army officers had not been in the Red Army before 1935. On the German side, it's almost the flip figure. Nearly 85% of all German generals and high-ranking German officers had served at least as a second lieutenant in World War I. There is no substitute for experience here. And the fact of the matter, this is an additional reason as to why, again, the Russians are going to get clobbered. Once again, I say to you, in Operation Barbarossa, in the first 3 or 4 months, the Red Army does not go from defeat to defeat. It goes from catastrophe to catastrophe. And I'm giving you the reasons for this. But when all is said and done, it's the Red Army that will prevail. And there are certain things that have to be said here. Again, Hitler made a number of mistakes. He should have taken Leningrad. He should have taken Stalingrad in the late summer and September of 1941. He should have done that. His hubris and his racial contempt for the Russians led Hitler to believe this would be a 12-week war. Well, knock him out. German soldiers in Operation Barbarossa in 1941 did not have winter clothing and did not have boots. German mechanized vehicles did not have antifreeze. When the Soviet resistance stiffens, that's going to bring the war into October. The October rains are going to play an important role here. And then, of course, comes the ferocious Russian winter. But you got to be careful here. Again, Hitler made a number of other mistakes. No German army in World War II was ever encircled. That's a tribute to German military proficiency and good generalship and to Allied incompetence. The only exception to this was at the Battle of Stalingrad. When General Paulus was about to be encircled at the Battle of Stalingrad, late 42 and early 1943, he begged Adolf Hitler for permission to withdraw. Hitler did not give him that permission. Hitler had promised the German people who will take Stalingrad. Goring had told him that the Luftwaffe will supply them and that other forces would break through the Soviet encirclement. Paulus had to surrender. That's the only German army that was ever encircled in the Second World War. So, but you got to be very careful here. The mistakes are great that Hitler makes. That is the Battle of Kursk, the Battle of the Kursk salient in the spring of 1943. The German High Command told Hitler, no, our soldiers are exhausted. Let them rest. Bring in new recruits in the spring of 1944. Bring in the new German Tiger tanks, then launch an offensive. Hitler wouldn't listen and got clobbered in the greatest tank battle in all of history, in the Battle of Kursk. But here's where I'm saying to you, got to be careful. You can't attribute the German defeat in Operation Barbarossa solely to Hitler's mistakes. That's what German generals said after the war. Like French generals said after their defeat in 1812 in Russia. You know what the French used to say? Forgive me if I'm repeating myself. We were defeated in Russia by 3 terrible Russian officers. That is, General Smallpox, again, Major General Smallpox, Major Winter, and of course, February rains and so on. That's not so. It's all true. But it's the French resilience. That's what did it. The refusal of Alexander I, Tsar Alexander I, to make any capitulation, to attack the French from the rear, and to trade again, as the Russians did in the Second World War, trade space and blood for time. That's what the Russians do. In the case on the Russian side, Stalin in the beginning was a terrible war leader. He disregarded, remember, the information that came from Richard Sorga in Tokyo. He disregarded that. And in fact, there is considerable evidence to suggest, I'll use an unmedical term, if there are any doctors out there, I'll use an unmedical term, there's reason to suspect that Stalin had a nervous breakdown. The first Russian official, a Soviet official, to address the Russian people, the Soviet people, it wasn't Stalin. It was Molotov, the foreign minister, on June 30th. Molotov's talk was a snoozeroo. He was not a good speaker. And one Soviet writer later on said, we were furious. Here we were being attacked. Here we were being attacked. And what do we get? We get this snoozeroo, this deficit, the man who had deficit charisma, Molotov, talking to us. Where was the Khazayan? Where was the boss? Well, the boss was probably having a breakdown. But on July 3rd, he does speak to the Soviet people. A very interesting incident took place. In the Kremlin, that is, Stalin is in a dacha. He's not there. The Central Committee is there. Where is Comrade Stalin? They go out to the dacha and they find him in bad shape. He thinks they're coming to arrest him because he has told them there'll be no war. They shape him up. And on July 3rd, Stalin addresses the Soviet people in a very calm way. We have been attacked. We have lost Soviet territory, but we're going to win. And then he establishes the basic policy that is one of the basic policies of Soviet resistance. This is what comes to be known as scorched earth. Give them nothing. Burn the wheat fields. Blow up the hydroelectric plants. Blow up all of those things that we created in European Russia in the 2 5-year plans. Give them nothing. Slaughter the cattle. Give them absolutely nothing. and there is to be no surrender. Anybody who's caught behind German lines is not to surrender, but should fight till the death. Now, that's not going to be the case. But Stalin is going to be, he's going to improve as a war leader. And there are always those intangibles in history. Early November 1941, the Germans are now pushing again on Moscow. Everybody is fleeing. Even high-ranking Communist Party officials are fleeing Moscow. They're going to the east. His advisors tell Stalin, get out of here. The Germans are going to take Moscow. And Stalin does not leave. He stands on Lenin's mausoleum when they commemorate the great Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers march past him. Some people argue that that's worth 10 to 15 Red Army divisions. That son of a bitch, Stalin, who has on his conscience, if he ever had a conscience, millions upon millions of people killed in the purges, killed in the collectivization, killed as a result of his mistakes in the war. But that he stood his ground in November of 1941, that is something that you cannot really put a price on. In addition to that, the Soviets were very, very good at evacuating industry. The man responsible for that was Alexei Kosygin, an engineer, a future leader of the Soviet Union in the late 40s and then actually in the mid-1950s. Millions of Soviet workers and their families were evacuated to the Ural Mountains and into Siberia. That's important in explaining the ultimate Soviet victory. In addition to that, as a result of the two 5-year plans, there was a vast industrial complex that had been created in the Ural Mountains in Siberia. One of the great German deficiencies in the Second World War is that the Germans did not have any long-range bombers. There's no German equivalent to our B-17s and our B-29s or the British Lancasters. There's no German equivalent to that. So the vast industrial complex that had been created in the Soviet Union in the 1930s was out of reach of the Germans. And it is from those great industrial complexes in the Ural Mountains and Siberia that the Soviets are able to gear up. By 1943, they are producing tens of thousands of planes. They are outproducing the Germans. That's important. And then finally, of course, or penultimately, Stalin will finally find some good generals. Now, there's a learning curve in everything, Whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, whatever you're doing, you're better 5 years out than the time when you first started. Many Red Army generals, now most of them have been purged, but some of them were really not competent. They were promoted on the basis of loyalty, always a bad thing to do. Promote generals on the basis of loyalty and not on the basis of competence. And so there are going to be some disasters, some real, very serious disasters. But eventually they're going to be weeded out. The same thing is going to happen in our army when some of our generals don't perform very, very well in North Africa. For an American general who does not perform well, you just ship him back to the United States, put him in charge of training. In the Red Army, if you don't perform well, either you're shot on the spot by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, or in more than one case, the memoir literature is very clear on this, those perceived to be incompetent generals, and not all of them were incompetent. Those who perceived to be incompetent were told by the local commissar, here's your choice. We arrest you, we put you on a public trial, you'll be killed and your family will be destroyed. Or you lead the attack. You personally lead the attack, which guarantees you in the first wave that you're going to be killed, and then you'll be hailed as a hero. That happened time and time again. With the passage of time, Stalin will find some very competent generals, and you should know the names of them. One of them I already mentioned to you, later Marshal Zhukov. Then there's General Chukov, the man at Stalingrad. There's Rokossovsky, there's Vatutin. These are the names, these are the great Red Army generals. And Stalin plays them off one against the other. That's very important. In addition to that, there's the iron discipline. Stalin issues an order about a year after the German attack. Not a step backwards, he says. Nobody is to retreat. You're to die right in place. And the discipline and the punishments. Are you aware of the fact that only one American soldier was shot for desertion in the Second World War? That's a young man by the name of Eddie Slovak. Poor kid, probably was shell-shocked, but they thought he was deserting. Probably wasn't deserting, he was just frightened out of his skin. He was shot. That's the only one on our side that's shot. Probably maybe less than 100 British soldiers were shot. Several thousand German soldiers were shot. At Stalingrad, the turning point in the war, at Stalingrad alone, 13,000 Red Army soldiers were shot for desertion. That's the official number. The official number given after the war for the total number of Red Army soldiers that were shot for desertion during the Second World War. And remember, official Soviet numbers aren't worth the paper they're written on, and they're always understated. But the official number given by the Soviet authorities after the war is that 160,000 Red Army soldiers were shot for desertion. That's the equivalent almost of 13 Red Army divisions. That iron discipline, the resilience of the peoples of the Soviet Union. After all, 1 million, I said this to you last time, 1 million men, women, and children will die in Leningrad from the starvation. 1 million people will die. No revolts here against the Soviet authorities. One should ask, could the American people have taken something like that? I'm not sure that they could have. And then finally, when we talk about the Soviet Union, we talk about Operation Barbarossa, Stalin finally learned to listen to Sorge. Because Sorge later on, after the German attack in June, Sorge tells Stalin, goes through Red Army intelligence. Stalin, again, is told by Sorge, and this time he listens, that the Japanese have decided on strike south. They're going to go into Malaya. They're going to go into Singapore. They're going to go into the Philippines. They're going to go into the Dutch East Indies. They are not going to go to strike north. They're not going to go from Mongolia into Siberia. They had been beaten in 1939 at the Battle of Khalkhin-Gao. The Japanese seem to have learned a lesson. One of the great Japanese mistakes during the Second World War is that they do not attack simultaneously with the Germans. Had they done so, who would have known what could have happened? But now that Sorge has told Stalin the Japanese are going to go south and they're not going to go north, Stalin now withdraws from Siberia hundreds of thousands of crack Siberian soldiers. This is the best that the Soviet Union has. These are the people who know how to fight in the snow, know how to fight in the winter. These are the people who have superb clothing and good boots. They are best armed, the best disciplined, and the best dressed of all Red Army soldiers. On December 6th of 1941, as the Battle of Moscow is taking place, this may be the greatest battle in terms of numbers in all of human history. There are 4 million men on both sides, that is a total of 4 million, of Red Army soldiers and Wehrmacht soldiers, German Army soldiers. Stalin is able to hurl those new Siberian soldiers in a counteroffensive on December 6th of 1941. This is the first time in Operation Barbarossa that the German army is in retreat. This is really important stuff here. So when all is said and done, Stalin turns out to be a better war leader than really was the case in the first part of the war. Now, there are other things that are happening, of course. And that is, remember, Churchill had come to see Roosevelt after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And Churchill convinces Roosevelt that it would be premature to attack France and drive to the Rhine in the spring of 42, as some American generals were arguing, or in the autumn of 42 or the spring of 43. Churchill convinces Roosevelt, and Roosevelt correctly goes along with it. Roosevelt agrees with Churchill. We must attack the Germans on the periphery, attack them in North Africa, attack them in Sicily, attack them in Italy, knock the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, out of the skies, to destroy the German industrial infrastructure. That's very, very significant. Significant both militarily and politically. Churchill and Roosevelt were right. To attack early on, before those things have been accomplished, would have been a terrible mistake. But remember, I think I may have said this to you, you cannot have your lunch, you cannot have your cake and eat it, can you? Because while we delay the second front, this is important, we'll talk more about this when we talk about the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. What do I mean when you say you cannot have your cake and eat it? While we are playing on the periphery, North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, the Red Army is pushing the Germans outside of Russian territory, moving into Poland and beginning to take over Eastern Europe. Therefore, we are presented with a fait accompli. Toward the end of the war, we got ourselves a problem. The Russians have taken over Poland, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, Romania, and Bulgaria, and Hungary. They've taken it all over. How are we going to get them out of there? Remember, how did the war start? The British and French came to the aid. They didn't do a good job of it, but they came to the aid of Poland, which had been attacked on September 1st, 1939. And now we want to do something for the Poles and the Czechs and the Slovaks, the Hungarians, the Romanians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and Estonians. But the Red Army is there. Again, Churchill and Roosevelt made the great decision. It was the correct decision. But nonetheless, we pay a heavy price for this. What we're really talking about, and we'll talk more about this next week, we are talking about the origins of the Cold War. So we are attacking at the periphery. First North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Now remember, the big picture is this. There's a learning curve in everything. Eisenhower has to learn, Patton has to learn, all of those American generals, some of them are incompetent and they will be removed. Some of them are more competent. They will be moved into higher positions, such as Patton, such as Ridgway eventually, a whole group of them, and Bradley, all these American generals that you all studied about in high school. They are moved up the ranks because of the incompetence of early American generals. Now, the one that was a real piece of work, and we'll come to him again, is General George Patton. You should know that for all of Patton's deficiencies, one of which was an anti-Semite. And Patton could be a very, very crude man. But nonetheless, Patton was the only American general that the Germans respected. Not Eisenhower, not Bradley, none of them. Not Clay, all were good generals. But from the German side, Patton was the only one. But when I tell you he was a piece of work, listen to this, my friends. Before they shipped out to North Africa, and Patton is with his soldiers, they're in training. Patton invites the wives of his officers to come to a ball, a last dinner at a ball before they ship out. And there is Patton standing on the platform, looking at these young women and saying, "Oh, you are so beautiful. You are going to make magnificently beautiful widows." Who says that, right? And then later, and this is important because personality is important, he's going to slap not a wounded American soldier. He's going to go through a hospital and see a number of badly wounded men. They're all bandaged up. They're in bad shape. They're getting all sorts of infusions. And then he sees an American soldier lying in a bed. And he says, what happened to you, soldier? And the soldier says to Patton, "General, I just couldn't take it anymore." And Patton slapped him across the face. American newspapers will pick that up, and General Eisenhower was furious with Patton. That's important for what's going to come in 1944. What is also, again, the learning curve. Hundreds of American soldiers, their families will never be told this, hundreds of American soldiers will be killed by friendly fire. The coordination between ground forces, artillery, and air power, it just isn't there in the North African campaign. for a certain period of time. We will learn, once again, for the third time. There's a learning curve in everything. And also, again, personality counts. The British had been clobbered in North Africa. They had done very well against the Italian soldiers, but when the Africa Corps came under Rommel, Rommel's going to clean the British clock. And Rommel is going to go, his aim is to get into Egypt and take the Suez Canal. The British are up against the wall, and the British are going to find their own piece of work. Again, if Patton is a pain in the ass to Eisenhower, an even greater pain in the ass to Eisenhower is General Bernard Law Montgomery. Montgomery was great on defense, absolutely great on defense. It is Montgomery that is going to, that's not Montgomery, that's Nimitz, and that's MacArthur. But if you can find Montgomery, Bernard Law Montgomery, Montgomery is sent to be in charge of the British Eighth Army, which is really, it's got its back up against the wall in Egypt. And Montgomery really shapes the British Eighth Army up. And the problem on Rommel's side, Rommel was great on offense, but he often outran his supply lines. And Hitler had made a mistake. The Germans should have taken, and it's worth a visit, incidentally, if you want to travel to the Mediterranean, visit the island of Malta. Malta was the great RAF base in the Mediterranean. Had the Germans taken Malta, the RAF would not have been able to intrude or intervene in the North African campaign. But because Malta held on, despite German encirclement, German embargoes, and German bombing, RAF planes could intercept German aircraft resupplying the Africa Corps. There's Bernard Montgomery. So here we are. We're in North Africa, and the Germans are going to be close to being surrounded. Montgomery stiffens the backbone of the British Eighth Army, goes over, defeats the Germans at the Battle of El Alamein. And almost simultaneously, the United States launches Operation Torch, November 8th, 1942. So we're coming in the western part of North Africa. Montgomery is moving again, pushing the Germans back from the eastern part of North Africa. There's a real possibility that the Germans will be encircled. They are not encircled. As I told you in the beginning, no German army, except for the Sixth Army in Stalingrad, no German army was ever encircled. One, the Germans are really good at extricating themselves, and Allied incompetence, the generals' incompetence, British and American generals, including Eisenhower, are not quick to encircle the German army. Now you may say to yourself, who cares that the German army wasn't encircled? But remember, an army that is not encircled is an army that can fight another day. Those Germans who break the encirclement, who are able to get out, will fight against us in Sicily. And because they're not encircled in Sicily, they will fight against us in the Italian campaign, a very, very brutal campaign. Here's a sidebar. If we are worried about the North African campaign and that Rommel will break through and take the Suez Canal, which I told you he did not do, forgive my crudeness, they're pissing in their boots in Palestine. That is the Yishuv. The close to 500,000 Jews in Palestine are really very nervous. They know what's going to happen to them if, in fact, Rommel makes his way into Palestine. And fortunately, that doesn't happen, but you should know there's a last-ditch plan by the leaders of the Jewish community in Palestine. If Rommel breaks through, takes the Suez Canal, crosses the Sinai, and moves into Palestine, Ben-Gurion and the leaders of the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, the leaders of the community, they are going to gather all of the Jews and bring them to Haifa, and the last stand of Jewish Palestine will be on Mount Carmel. That's going to be the last stand of Jewish Palestine, if in fact Rommel breaks through. But as we know, he does not break through. So we go from North Africa, we go to Sicily, and we go to Italy. We're going to pay a heavy price. Thousands, tens of thousands of American soldiers are going to die. And I must tell you, everybody travels to Italy. Let me tell you, I think I mentioned this to you before, and I'll come back to it when we talk about the invasion of Normandy next week. The next time you go to Italy, if you go on a tour, ask the one who leads the tour to take you to an American cemetery. There are a number of American cemeteries in Italy. This is considered to be American territory. They are kept immaculately. And when again you see, I may have said this to you before, when you see those waves of crosses and an occasional Jewish star, you know the price that was paid there in the campaign. So again, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, the Germans are being pushed back on the periphery, and we are beginning to bomb Germany. We bomb by day, and the RAF bombs by night. The bombing campaign is one of the more controversial campaigns of the Second World War. It is, as one writer in the Wall Street Journal put it very recently, looking at the campaign, reviewing a book, it was a tension or a conflict between morality and necessity. A conflict between morality and necessity. Keep in mind that precision bombing is an oxymoron. You can think you're going to spare civilians, but you never can spare civilians. We will kill close to 800,000 German men, women, and children from the civilian bombing, from the bombing of German cities. Was it necessary? Now you got to keep in mind here. Remember, I'm telling you, I said in the beginning, I tell my students, the first day of every course I teach at Union, you can't divorce a historical actor, actress, or action from the time in which it's taking place. It's not whether you should have done this or should have done that, looking back from the vantage point of 2025. You've got to think what's happening in that period of time in the bombing campaign. It is true that the strategic bombing survey that was conducted after the war showed that German industrial production actually increased under our bombing, actually increased. But, and this is a very important but, number one, would it have increased even more had the bombing not taken place? Number two, by bombing Germany, we forced Hitler to bring the Luftwaffe back from the Eastern Front and from the Western Front. We had near control over the skies. And if you are the child of a World War II combat veteran in the European theater, who fought in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, and in Normandy, and in the race to the Rhine, and in Germany, one of the reasons that you're here is we had tremendous air superiority. And we had that tremendous air superiority because we had knocked the Luftwaffe, for the most part, out of the skies. So, one last incident before we shift over to the Pacific. A very interesting incident took place. Now, I know my limitations. I'm not a physician, but I will tell you about an interesting incident that took place. We, from Anzio and Salerno, those are the places where we landed in southern Italy, we eventually took Naples. In Naples, unknown to most American generals and nearly all British generals, and certainly unknown to the American public and to American soldiers in the Italian campaign, there was an American ship in Naples port, in the Naples harbor, that was loaded with mustard gas, poison gas. We weren't going to use it, but we worried that the Germans would use it. And if the Germans were going to use it, we were going to use it. So there is a large ship filled, a cargo ship filled with American mustard gas. The Germans launched an attack upon the port of Naples. They didn't know that one of the ships had poison gas. That ship, having the poison gas, was blown up by the Germans. The mustard gas spread out. Hundreds of Americans and maybe several thousand Italian civilians were gassed by the mustard gas. We were slow on the uptake here. We did not inform American doctors about what had happened initially. Therefore, one of the lessons of World War I was not utilized. One of the things that was learned in World War I is the first thing that you do if a soldier's been gassed is you take off his clothing and you put him in a bath. You don't want him to imbibe or really breathe in the gas from his uniform. That was not known. So eventually they know and they deal with it. An article appeared in one of the newspapers in Washington, D.C. about the incident. It was withdrawn immediately, and there was never any comment about it for the rest of the war. Now, when I tell you I know my limitations here, if there are any doctors out there, you can correct me, but this is the way the story is told by American military historians. American pathologists will come and they'll do autopsies on some of the dead Americans and dead Italians. They will find that they have a dramatically reduced white blood cell count. That, I have been told by physicians and from the literature, that from that experience and from that mustard gas will be the first chemical derivatives that will be used to treat leukemia. So when all is said and done, we've knocked the Germans out of the periphery. Then, again, the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, destroyed. The Germans, like the Japanese, were never very good, never paid attention to recruiting large numbers of pilots. So when German pilots were shot down and Japanese pilots were shot down, it was hard to replace them. And the other thing, of course, what the campaign against Germany does, German industrial production may have increased, but we knocked the living daylights out of German petroleum production and German gasoline refining. When German soldiers attack at the Battle of the Bulge, they're going to run out, German tanks will run out of fuel. So, last point before we leave Europe and go to the Pacific. Sometime between, we think, October and December of 1941, Adolf Hitler has decided, to use his expression, to settle accounts with the Jews. Most historians, nearly all Holocaust historians, say that the decision to exterminate all of European Jewry is made sometime between October and December of 1941. Hitler made public speeches to German Nazi leaders, to Gauleiters. In addition to that, a number of high-ranking Germans will testify after the war, write in their memoirs, and say before they are executed, that Hitler told them, personally told them, it is time to settle accounts with the Jews. There is a phenomenon in the Nazi hierarchy, one of the dynamic processes at work here, of what is known as marching towards the Führer. That is, Germans will say, as early as 1939, before the war was over, we know what our Führer wants. It is our job to execute, to implement what he wants. And so, having made the decision to exterminate European Jewry, having made that decision, Hitler now communicates personally to high-ranking Germans, including Commandant Heuss, the most important commandant of Auschwitz, that we've got to, again, eliminate the Jews from the face of Europe, if not from the face of the world. There is no Hitler Befehl, no Hitler order. We've searched in vain for a piece of paper that would tell us Hitler is a Hitler order. That doesn't exist. What exists is what I told you. That is the speeches, and then the communication to individual Germans, and then, of course, that marching towards the Führer. That's why on January 20th of 1942, in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, W-A-N-N-S-E-E, at Wannsee, a conference will be held. It's presided over by Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Gestapo, deputy head of the SS, one of the architects of the so-called final solution. The man who takes the notes for that conference is Adolf Eichmann, the head of Section 4B4 of the Reich Security Main Agency. They are now working out, they're marching towards their Führer, and they're working out the destruction of European Jewry. So we don't have much time left. We've got to move into the Pacific. We've got to claw back victory in the Pacific. We're now talking about the time after Pearl Harbor. It is remarkable, absolutely remarkable, that 7 months, within 7 months of the attack on Pearl Harbor, we are able to stop the Japanese and we're able to go over to the offensive. We stopped the Japanese at 2 great naval battles, the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. Now, Stephen out there has told that he has done very well in talking about the code breaking of Rochefort. Suffice it to say, we break some of the German codes. Rochefort knows that they're going towards Midway. The resilience and the bravery of American pilots and the incredible luck that we attack a Japanese aircraft carrier while their planes are being refueled. So all of this is going to stop the Japanese. Remember what Yamamoto is reputed to have said. If I knock the Americans or destroy the American Pacific Fleet, he is reputed to have said the war is winnable. They cannot knock out the American Pacific Fleet. And once again, we have not spoken about this, but this is for next week. The Japanese will lose 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. We will lose some aircraft carriers, but we can build them. The Japanese industrial production capacity is just not that great. There's no match between our industrial capacity and the Japanese industrial capacity. We will roll out those aircraft carriers, roll out those destroyers, roll out those battleships, roll out the submarines. Here, jumping ahead now, but to make some basic points about the war in the Pacific. We're going to win that war in the Pacific for a number of reasons, one of which the Japanese have committed close to 1 million men in China. That is not the best, but most of the Japanese soldiers are not in those islands that we are going to take. They're in China, and they're getting bogged down in China. Chiang Kai-shek, not the best war leader, and Mao Zedong, not a particularly good war leader either. They're fighting amongst themselves, sometimes more than they're fighting against the Japanese, but they're conducting a war of attrition against the Japanese. They're sucking the Japanese deeper and deeper into China, and the Chinese are in a familiar problem. They have a familiar problem. They've lost hundreds of thousands of men already in China. How do you tell the Japanese people? Well, we're pulling out of China. We can't do it. So they stay in China, tying down, again, close to 1 million men in China. Had we had a problem, had we been able to deal, had the Japanese been able to shift 1 million men from the Asian mainland to those islands, we would have won. In any event, we would have won. But the war would have taken longer and we would have paid a much heavier price. In addition to that, one of the gliding principles that military historians say about the war in the Pacific, probably the best, the most effective arm of the American military war effort in the Second World War is the American Navy, both the surface fleet and the submarine fleet. We are going to destroy all Japanese merchant marine shipping. We will deny the Japanese of important raw materials. And we're going to get better. There's a learning curve here too. Some of our torpedoes launched by the submarines are defective. Some of our sailors, do you know that in the early part of the Second World War, there was so much panic among American submariners that in some cases, American sailors on the submarines had to be chained to their bunks because of the fear of Japanese depth charges. This is no criticism. Who am I to criticize them? I've talked to people who are veterans of the submarines in that particular part of the war. They tell me you haven't lived unless you've really been under a depth charge attack. When those depth charges go off and the submarine rocks back and forth and you begin to fear about leaks, you're pissing in your boots. That's what you're doing. But we're going to learn. Our sailors will get accustomed to that. Our torpedoes will get better. And American seamanship is far better than the Japanese. Again, all of this taken together. And our planes are getting better. In the first part of the war, we have nothing that can compare with the Japanese Zero. But then come the Hellcats, and then the Wildcats, and then the Corsairs. And then we're going to sweep the skies of the Japanese Zeros. In June of 1944, in the Mariana Islands, this is the Mariana Turkey Shoot, will destroy hundreds of Japanese planes. We now control the skies. We now control the seas. But again, we've got to take, there's nothing like boots on the ground. We got to take those islands. We got to take Guadalcanal. We got to take Tarawa. We got to take Tinian. We got to take Saipan. Then we got to take Iwo Jima. We've got to take Okinawa. And that's when the blood is going to flow. All right, my friends, I brought you to Normandy, and we're going to soon win the war in the Pacific. Are there any questions?
There's always questions. We have time for just a few here, what I have. There was a question about, names of different operations. Barbarossa, why was it called Barbarossa?
Barbarossa was a great German king in the medieval period. And he enjoyed a great deal of success in the Crusades. And so the Germans Hitler wanted to give that name. That's why it's called Operation Barbarossa.
Thank you. There was a question of whether you think, or what the theory is out there about Stalin, and did he let Leningrad suffer for political reasons, or was that
No, I think
just errors?
That's not true. He doesn't let Leningrad suffer for political reasons. He lets Leningrad suffer because he doesn't have the troops to come to the defense of Leningrad. That's why Leningrad is going to suffer. But there's one way out. That's Lake Ladoga that freezes over in the wintertime. And there will be supplies. There'll be evacuation of people through Lake Ladoga. And again, some supplies will come in to Lake Ladoga. But here, I'll give you one incident to show you what it's all about. This is in Harrison Salisbury's book. A guy tells Salisbury after the war, there were always people in Leningrad. While everybody else was starving, there were always people that were very well fed, very, very sleepy. So I asked one of these guys that he's telling Salisbury, I asked one of these guys, where are you getting the meat from? And the guy says, you got any money? Come with me. He goes, the guy was telling Salisbury, goes with this guy. They go to a warehouse, open up the warehouse, and what does he see? He sees human carcasses hanging from the rafters. These people are cannibals. And the meat that they were selling was human meat. He tear-asses right out of there, to use the old expression, runs into an NKVD unit, tells them what he has seen. They go, they kill everybody in the warehouse. That's what it is in Leningrad. Anything else, Aaron?
There was someone who asked a question about whether you can ascribe superiority air power to the Polish pilots who participated. Is that something that's
10% of the RAF in the Battle of Britain was composed of Polish pilots. Polish pilots were very, very good. Now, what is also true, sometimes they don't say it in Great Britain. They didn't say it for a long period of time. Some of the pilots that fought in the RAF were Jews from Palestine. The most famous of them, Chaim Weizmann's son, was killed fighting for the RAF. Asa Weizmann, the architect of the victory in the Six-Day War, the preemptive attack by the Israeli Air Force, he fought for the RAF. He is a point to remember, my friends. At least 30,000 Jewish men and women fought for the British in World War II. Remember what Ben-Gurion had said, for those of you that are familiar with the history of Israel, the history of Zionism. The white paper curtailed Jewish immigration into Palestine. Ben-Gurion said, the famous remark went something like this: we will fight the white paper as if there's no war. We will fight the war as if there's no white paper. Which means the orders went out, the urging went out to Jewish men and women in Palestine. volunteer to fight for the British. And I may have said this to you before. When we go to a Jewish bar mitzvah or a Jewish wedding, what's the song that they play? Hava Nagila. What's the song? The other song, Senet Sena. Senet Sena is a recruiting song that was given by the Yeshuv, the leaders of the Zionist movement within Palestine. You look at the words, Senet Sena. Look at the soldier, how handsome he looks in the uniform. I mention this to you, not to give you an interesting historical anecdote, but if you want to understand it goes beyond this course. If we have another lecture series, we'll deal with it. One of the reasons that Israel will prevail in 1948 is the qualitative advantage that the Israel Defense Forces have by virtue of the fact that 30,000 men and women had fought for the British, learning how to fight, learning discipline, learning how to master the new weapons. Every Israeli chief of staff going into the 70s and the early 80s had fought in one capacity or another for the British. The most famous of them all is the man with the eye patch, Moshe Dayan, who lost his eye. That eye lost his eye fighting for the British in the Middle East. All right, Ari. Dayenu. Enough is enough.
Moshe Dayenu.
Moshe Dayenu. Right on.
We'll go. One person had a question I'd like to just follow up because apparently their uncle died in World War II, and apparently he died in India. So was there a battle that we didn't talk about that you can mention
Ari,
just in memory of this person?
Yeah, Ari, remember, I got to pick my shots here. There is fighting in India and in Burma. There is very heavy fighting there. And it's brutal fighting because of the conditions. Absolutely right. There are some who say that the best general among the British and the Americans in both theaters, in the Asian theater and in the European theater, was the British general, General Slim, S-L-I-M. General Slim was a superb general. If you like to take your history through film, there's a film on Merrill's Marauders, people who parachuted behind Japanese lines. It is a brutal war in Asia. It's a brutal war in the Pacific, not only, I must say, because of the resistance of Japanese soldiers. One of the things that will be learned early on, Japanese soldiers do not surrender. In addition to that, you know, we're sending these young boys, we're sending them out. What do they know from malaria? What do they know from tropical diseases? What do they know from snakes? In addition to all of the other tsaros that American soldiers and Marines are going to have to deal with in the Pacific and in the Asian theaters, it's those tropical diseases, that incredible heat, and so on. Anything else, Ari?
No, we're going to have pity on you and let you go relax in Florida. But people are sharing stories about their family who fought against Rommel from Palestine. They joined the British Army. So there's some great connections of people in the audience to what you've been talking about. And
Can you give me one last word? My friends, I've always prided myself on learning from my students. You may be the best audience that I've ever spoken to. The questions are very good. Here's my email. You can take it down. berks@union, berks@union.edu. Very simple. Now, I must tell you, I peg away with one finger, not my thumb, my index finger. So if you send me a question, don't wait for me to give you an email response. Give me your telephone number. Call me. I'm married to a woman who stalks the night. Stalks the night. We go to sleep 2 or 3 in the morning. So you can call me. Here's my number, 518-727-9696. 518-727-9696. If I don't answer, leave your telephone number and I'll get you back. All right. Thank you again. Shalom uvracha.
Thank you, everybody. Look forward to see you next week when you wrap up this class. Terrific presentation. We'll have some great follow-up for you to read. And you are a great audience.
Take care.
Take care. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.